The war had ended, but its colossal monuments remained, scattered across Europe like silent witnesses to a brutal past. The massive bunkers, once symbols of Nazi power and defense, now stood abandoned, their concrete walls slowly crumbling under the weight of time. What would become of these imposing structures, once built to withstand the worst, now reduced to relics of a bygone era? As Europe struggled to rebuild, the fate of these war machines became uncertain. Some were repurposed, some left to decay, and some erased entirely. But in the shadows of their dilapidation, a haunting question remained. How do you dispose of the legacy of war? The world stood still in 1945. The war was over, but its remnants remained, scattered like ghostly monuments across Europe. Across the continent, colossal bunkers, designed to withstand bombardments and shelter entire armies, stood abandoned, empty shells of their former purpose. As the dust of war settled, the question arose, what became of these imposing structures that once served as symbols of Nazi strength? Built on a scale so massive that they could house entire divisions, these bunkers were once the epicenters of military strategy, control, and power. Their concrete walls, up to 6 meters thick, were impregnable to most conventional weapons of the time. But by 1945, those same structures, once symbols of invincibility, were rendered obsolete by the end of active combat and the changing political realities of post-war Europe. The aftermath of World War II did not simply mean the cessation of hostilities. It was a time of logistical chaos, with nations scrambling to deal with the material burden left behind by 6 years of war. Europe lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its economies in tatters. For Germany, the immediate focus was on survival, feeding a population, rebuilding infrastructure, and coming to terms with the staggering losses, both human and material. Among the many assets that had once been vital to the Nazi war machine, the bunkers posed a unique challenge. Hundreds of these fortifications were scattered along the coastlines of France, Belgium, Norway, and across the German heartland. Originally built as a defense against Allied invasion, particularly the feared D-Day assault, they were now without a purpose. Their survival was no longer guaranteed, it was simply a matter of what to do with them. Their size and strength made them difficult to demolish, yet their very existence was a stark reminder of the failed regime that had constructed them. Some bunkers were quickly abandoned, left to decay in the elements. Without any strategic military role, they became useless to both the occupying Allied forces and the newly formed governments of post-war Europe. A few were repurposed for immediate post-war needs: warehouses for food storage, makeshift housing for displaced civilians, or even storage for weapons and ammunition. But the bulk of these structures were soon seen as a drain on resources, and the reality of post-war austerity meant there was little money to spare for their maintenance or even their demolition. In the immediate aftermath, the first actions taken by the Allied forces were largely pragmatic. The bunkers that had once served as command centers or storage depots were systematically stripped of any useful materials. Steel reinforcements were salvaged, and any remaining equipment was taken for use in the reconstruction of Europe. At the same time, the task of demolishing the bunkers was left to individual nations, a job that proved daunting given the sheer scale of the structures and the lack of resources to carry it out effectively. By 1947, it became clear that the bunkers were not going to be easily erased. The economic conditions of the time made large-scale demolition efforts unfeasible. The fact that much of the steel and concrete in these structures could still be used in reconstruction projects made it tempting to dismantle them, if only it were financially viable. But as the European economy slowly began its recovery, the focus shifted elsewhere. Demolition projects were few and far between, with limited manpower and material support available for such undertakings. This left the bunkers in a sort of limbo. They were neither completely destroyed nor left in their original state. Some bunkers, particularly those in more remote areas, were simply abandoned, slowly consumed by nature. The areas around them were left to rewild. Wild grasses and trees began creeping up their sides, the harsh lines of concrete softened by the passage of time. Others, in more strategic locations, were repurposed in small ways. They became storage sheds, shelters for farmers, or even parts of larger civilian infrastructure projects. However, none of these repurposing efforts were large-scale or coordinated. Instead, they were individual acts of pragmatism, born out of necessity rather than any overarching plan. Perhaps the most striking feature of these bunkers in the post-war period was their sheer permanence. The scale of the structures, combined with the lack of sufficient resources for complete demolition, meant that many of the bunkers would stand for decades to come, untouched and unaltered. These relics from the war became silent witnesses to the decades of tension and fear that followed. The Cold War that began in the late 1940s would bring its own pressures to Europe, but these bunkers, now disconnected from their original purpose, would not be part of that new conflict. They would remain frozen in time, increasingly irrelevant but unable to fade away completely. Over time, however, as European economies stabilized and military needs shifted, the bunkers were either left to rot or repurposed for civilian use. A small number were eventually transformed into museums, serving as reminders of the war and of the militarized history that had shaped Europe in the first half of the 20th century. Others were incorporated into growing urban landscapes, sometimes buried beneath new construction projects, their true identities hidden under layers of concrete and steel. The fate of these bunkers was not uniform. It depended on where they were located, who controlled them, and the immediate economic pressures that shaped post-war Europe. Yet even as some bunkers were preserved or repurposed, many others were dismantled, stripped for materials, or demolished. By the 1950s, the process of deconstructing the wartime legacy was well underway, with the remaining bunkers seen as relics of a brutal past. The economies of Western Europe, now focused on rebuilding and integrating into the emerging global economy, had little use for these cold, lifeless fortresses. The remnants of Nazi military architecture were seen less as historical artifacts and more as unsightly obstacles in the path of progress. And so, the question lingered: what was the true fate of these monolithic remnants? The answer was as varied as the bunkers themselves. Some would be forgotten, buried beneath new developments and landscapes. Others would serve as stark markers of history, standing as silent testaments to the time when their creators believed they could withstand the ravages of war. But for most, the story of the German bunkers after World War II was one of gradual neglect. No grand plans were made for their future. They were simply allowed to fade into the landscape, silent and still, their history increasingly distant with each passing decade. After the immediate post-war years, the fate of the German bunkers remained uncertain, subject to a complex mix of bureaucratic inaction, economic realities, and shifting political landscapes. The initial decisions had been largely pragmatic. The bunkers were stripped for usable materials, and many were left to their own devices, abandoned or repurposed in the most temporary ways. But as the years stretched into the 1950s and beyond, new realities began to emerge. The bunkers, once the embodiment of Nazi military power, were now relics of a bygone era. Their future would be defined not by military strategy but by civilian needs, economic pressure, and the broader ideological shifts of Cold War Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had focused their energies on reconstructing war-torn Europe, though the priorities of each were dramatically different. The Western Allies were invested in rebuilding European economies through programs such as the Marshall Plan, which sought to stimulate industry and rebuild infrastructure. For them, the bunkers, like much of the war debris, were an afterthought. The focus was on restoring stability and securing the region against the looming Soviet threat. As a result, many bunkers, especially those in Western Europe, found themselves neglected, left to deteriorate in the rapidly changing political climate. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Europe had become deeply divided. The Iron Curtain had descended, and the Cold War had begun in earnest. The once pervasive sense of shared purpose that had accompanied the war effort was now replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion, espionage, and ideological struggle. In Western Europe, countries like France, Belgium, and Norway, where German bunkers had once formed the backbone of defensive strategies, were now more focused on aligning with the United States in the face of the Soviet threat than dealing with the remnants of the Nazi regime. Their bunkers, in the grand scheme of Cold War geopolitics, were irrelevant. The repurposing of these bunkers began in earnest not as a military strategy but as a reaction to the severe shortage of housing, storage, and industrial space that plagued Europe in the post-war period. By the early 1950s, most Western European countries had a significant housing crisis on their hands, and many of these fortifications, especially those located in rural or less populated areas, were converted into temporary shelters. Some were used to house refugees and displaced persons, while others became the site of makeshift communities. Families moved into bunkers, living in dark, oppressive environments, the very walls that had once been built to withstand military might now holding civilians who had nothing but survival in mind. Elsewhere, the bunkers that had been left empty for years were slowly converted into storage spaces. The steel and concrete that had once protected vital military installations now became a resource in the rebuilding of post-war Europe. At times, these bunkers were reappropriated by new, small-scale businesses that sought space for warehouses, factories, or even underground markets. The conditions were hardly ideal, with damp, dark interiors and limited ventilation, but the sheer size and strength of these structures made them valuable for whatever could be salvaged. In France, for example, some bunkers were converted into grain storage facilities, while in Germany, others became agricultural depots. In a few cases, the bunkers were turned into emergency shelters for the homeless or even underground medical centers. Yet, despite this repurposing, the bunkers remained mostly unmodified. Many were not adapted for civilian life, and their dark, cold interiors remained inhospitable. By the end of the 1950s, as Europe's recovery continued, the economic pressure to make full use of these structures waned. The necessity of immediate post-war solutions was no longer as urgent, and the bunkers that had once been used for such practical purposes were largely abandoned once again. By the 1960s, a new generation of Europeans began to look at the bunkers not as a temporary solution but as historical curiosities, remnants of a conflict long over but still haunting the landscape. The bunkers that had once served as symbols of war had now become symbols of something else, the Cold War division of Europe. In both East and West, they stood as physical reminders of a time when war had ravaged the continent and threatened to plunge it back into chaos. In some places, these bunkers were incorporated into the growing number of war memorials that dotted the European landscape. In Germany, for example, the remnants of these bunkers were often preserved as part of larger efforts to memorialize the war and its aftermath. Some were even turned into museums, where the public could visit and learn about the war, the Nazi regime, and the legacy of militarization. The most famous of these repurposed bunkers was the Atlantic Wall, a series of coastal fortifications that ran from Norway to the French-Spanish border. The bunkers, which had once been part of Hitler's defense against an Allied invasion, were now preserved as part of a larger effort to educate the public about the horrors of the war and the cost of militarism. In France and the Netherlands, remnants of the Atlantic Wall were turned into museums and historical sites, attracting tourists eager to understand the reality of wartime Europe. These repurposed bunkers provided a strange kind of historical closure, a place where visitors could walk in the footsteps of soldiers and civilians who had lived through the darkest days of the war. Yet, for all their historical significance, these repurposed bunkers remained few and far between. Most of the structures fell into disrepair, ignored by both governments and the public. As the decades passed, the costs of maintaining these structures became prohibitive, especially as new political realities began to shape Europe. The Cold War continued to exert its influence, and the bunkers that had once been the backbone of Nazi defense were now seen as relics of an ideology that had been soundly defeated. As Europe's urban centers expanded and new construction projects took hold, many of the bunkers were eventually buried under new buildings or incorporated into the infrastructure of growing cities. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new wave of urbanization swept through Western Europe, and the bunkers that had once been symbols of Nazi military might were now seen as impediments to development. The scale of demolition during this period was massive. Whole stretches of the Atlantic Wall, once so imposing in their size and strength, were dismantled or buried beneath new housing projects, roads, and industrial complexes. The rise of post-war consumer culture, combined with a growing sense of modernity and progress, rendered the bunkers increasingly obsolete. They were viewed as eyesores, reminders of a past best left behind. In Germany, where the bunkers were seen as a reminder of the Third Reich, the decision to remove or repurpose them was even more pronounced. The country's post-war reconstruction efforts focused on erasing the legacy of Nazi militarism and moving forward with a new identity. While some bunkers were preserved as historical landmarks, the majority were demolished or buried. Those that survived often became part of larger urban landscapes, hidden beneath the fabric of new cities and communities. In some cases, these structures became part of secretive military installations or training sites, though their role was a far cry from their original purpose. The fate of these German bunkers was not uniform. In some cases, the bunkers were abandoned and allowed to slowly disintegrate under the force of nature. Rusted metal doors and shattered windows, once designed to protect, now served as silent witnesses to the passage of time. These bunkers, while still standing, became eerie monuments to a failed vision, crumbling away in solitude. For the most part, the bunkers that survived the 1950s and 1960s did so not because they were preserved out of respect for their history, but because of their sheer scale and the high cost of dismantling them. The question of what to do with the bunkers persisted throughout the 20th century, but the reality was that the era of their usefulness had long passed. By the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War meant that the bunkers were no longer relevant even as symbols of military defense. The political climate had shifted once again, and the bunkers were increasingly seen as vestiges of a Europe divided by ideology and war. They became part of a forgotten past, relegated to the margins of history.